That's right. The U.S. Department of the Treasury has just released that list. Of course, we heard from the White House press secretary just in the last few hours that now the U.S. is joining Europe and sanctioning President Vladimir Putin directly, as well as his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, the Department of the Treasury says that it is exceedingly rare for the Treasury to sanction heads of state, and that Vladimir Putin joins the likes of Kim Jong-un and Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus and Bashar al-Assad of Syria. Now, as to the full list, some of those notable names, of course, the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service, the State Duma speaker, and the commander of the National Guard troops, as well as the general of the Russian armed forces. So certainly Putin's top circle, members of his cabinet. But at the end of the day, it must be noted, this is very much symbolic, particularly in the United States. There seems to be very little that President Putin has here that he would be prevented from accessing. He mostly really keeps a lot of that wealth with others loyal to him in his circle. And so that may not hurt him as much as perhaps the U.S. hoped it would. The Russians certainly saying that it is of no consequence at this point. But I just want to make sure that it's clear what, the implications of these sanctions really apply mainly to U.S. persons, and that doesn't just include American citizens or passport holders, but also anybody doing business in the United States. You can't run transactions through the U.S. that involve these sanctioned persons. Of course, you can't do any business with them directly if you're based in the U.S. And also if you essentially have an entity that you own 50% or more, you also would not be able to do business within that entity at this point with those people listed. So the U.S. going certainly as far as now Joe Biden promised when he said a few weeks ago that he would be willing to consider sanctioning President Putin directly. The president making it very clear, no U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. They're saying at this point that they can't even enact a no-fly zone, that would certainly implicate the U.S. There are other issues, of course, like at this point, the U.S. only arms Ukraine with defensive weapons, not offensive ones. Now, if it does arm them offensively, there are several legal hurdles there, according to some U.S. officials, that would potentially make the U.S. some kind of co-conspirator, and that would mean a declaration of war against Russia by the U.S. So they're treading very carefully here. The U.S. also considering how it can continue to train members of the Ukrainian military if Russia indeed takes hold of the capital, Kyiv. They're considering doing that remotely, which is something the Pentagon has not done before. So certainly a lot of actions to be considered, but the U.S. is trying to be as careful as possible here because, of course, we are talking about a nuclear power, Russia, and that's something President Putin himself has brought up in his recent speeches that, warning the West of consequences specifically because Russia is a nuclear power.
And it's good seeing you, so thank you for your time. First, let me just draw your attention to something Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has just said. On Friday night, he said that Friday night was a make or break moment for Ukraine. The night will be very difficult, and that the enemy will use all available forces to break the resistance of Ukrainians, and that the fate of Ukraine is being decided right now. What is your assessment of what we've seen over the last 2 days?
Well, we've seen a full onslaught from Russian forces, a lot of artillery and airstrikes targeting Kharkiv, of course, but also different spots along the coast, Mariupol, and, of course, Kyiv. The assessment from President Zelensky, which he posted on Telegram, suggests that they are expecting a major assault tonight. And Ukrainian forces have had some success actually repelling and keeping Russian forces at bay. This surprised a lot of folks. there was an expectation that Russians would be able to land at an airfield very close to Kiev and deploy paratroopers. That expectation did not pan out. So you're beginning to see some success from the Ukrainian forces in keeping Russia at bay. This statement from Zelensky suggests that they are now expecting a redoubling of Russian efforts, and tonight could be very decisive in terms of the future flow of conflict. So I think he's just preparing his population for what's sure to be a very difficult night with very difficult bombardment. For months now, going back to November, Russian forces, proxy forces in the Donbass have been making increasingly wild and unverified claims of Ukrainian hostile action. Those haven't been verified by any international monitors, any humanitarian rights groups. So what you're seeing right now, there are definitely civilian pieces of infrastructure that have been hit. We're not sure the intentionality behind it. That's something that is going to go into a later discussion about possible war crimes. Ukrainian officials have asked for people to record and send evidence of potential war crimes that could lead to an investigation like that. It's too early to say, though, how exactly those different strikes have played out in those different civilian areas. It does speak to the Russian way of war. If you look at, for instance, their campaign over Syria, if you look at their campaign over Chechnya, you see that precision bombing isn't exactly the thing that the Russian Air Force does. You see a lot of indiscriminate use of gravity bombs as opposed to precision weaponry. So it's certainly within the possibility that you would have civilian infrastructure that was hit, not necessarily intentionally targeted, but this does align with previous Russian air campaigns, which have certainly taken a big toll on civilian populations in places like Syria and Chechnya. And clearly the Russian government was anticipating pretty heavy sanction activity before going into this. If you look to some of those initial public displays that Putin orchestrated just before going in, where he had senior Russian officials join him in the Russian capital and basically all sign on to this action, you can see the kind of glumness in their faces, as I think there was a collective realization among them that they were all going to be hit with international sanctions. And they made statements to the effect of, we understand that the international community is going to affect us with different financial penalties. It's not entering into his calculus right now, but it's one of those things like international condemnation from the global community, like the resistance that we're now seeing from Ukrainian forces. The longer this drags on, the higher the costs begin to be for him, and the lower the support he can realize among officials and also among the Russian population. So if this turns very quickly in Russia's favor and they're able to secure different government functions within Ukraine, God forbid, then the sanctions penalty will have been part of their calculus, and you can see that perhaps they thought that it was worth it. But overall, if this conflict extends longer, then those sanctions, the other penalties, really begin to bite. And there are a lot of evidence to suggest that the only sanctions that really have ever worked against Russia are the ones that have targeted officials specifically rather than the Russian population. So there has been some maneuvering of different sanctions over the years, particularly after 2014, adjusting them so that they apply more directly to Russian officials, and those have been seen as somewhat more effective, but clearly they didn't enter into any sort of deterrence calculus for Vladimir Putin. They were anticipating them, and they made statements to that effect.